Alright, welcome to part 2 of the tool storage series. In this part, I'll be creating storage for the jigsaw, so stay tuned. I quickly inspected the jigsaw just to figure out a locking mechanism. I'll be using this scrap piece of plywood, so the first thing I have to do is to make it square. I cut and removed the excess material on the miter saw. Now it's time to cut a straight edge on the table saw. I adjust the height of the blade, I set the fence, and then I made the cut. So the first thing I'll be making is a flat bed where the saw sits. So I put the saw on top of the plywood and I drew some guidelines around the blade. I'm going to be storing this saw with the blade still attached to it, so I have to drill a hole so that the blade is able to go through the bed. I used this square to extend the guidelines. This is going to be more like a slot because I need the blade to be able to slide back and forth. I'm designing it so once I put the saw to sit on top of the bed, then I'll be able to slide it to lock it into place. I put a scrap piece of wood at the bottom so that I could reduce the chance of a tear out. Then I start to drill. So the idea was to drill 2 holes at the edge of the slot, then use a scoping saw to finish the cutout. But it wasn't until afterwards I realized this wasn't the best way of doing it. I complete the cutout using the scoping saw, and afterwards that's when I realized the cut was not as straight as I wanted it to be. So I went back to the drill press to finish up. Instead, initially I should have used the drill press to drill repeated holes inside the guidelines, and that would have been a better way of doing it. So right here I'm carefully using the drill press, and I'm trying to keep as close as possible to the guidelines. I use the file to remove the rough edges and try to make the slot line as straight as possible. I clamp the piece to the workbench as I prepare to round over the edges with the router. I clamp the bed and a piece of wood onto the workbench. The wood is going to act as a fence guide so that when I slide the router back and forth, it's going to slide in the same path all the time. After that, it was time for me to figure out the locking mechanism. And this was the hardest part to figure out. But after a couple trials and errors, this is what I came up with. So I'm basically going to make an invert cutout of the bottom of the jigsaw. This is what's going to lock the saw into place after I slide it after putting it onto the bed. I use the table saw sled to make the cutout. I start by cutting the lowest point first, then I moved on to the highest point. And this is what it looks like. I test fit the locking mechanism and make sure it works the way it's supposed to, and then I cut off the excess material in the miter saw. I applied some glue, then I clamped it onto the bed and wiped away the excess glue. I drilled some pilot holes for the screws. I didn't want to use nails because I was afraid that it might split the wood, so in this case I'm just going to be using screws. I carefully installed the screw, then I moved on to the fence guide. I copied the length of the fence, then I made the cut on the miter saw. I glued and I secured it with nails, then I moved on to the other fence. I made the other fence shorter than the first one because after a few test fits, I realized that it didn't need to be as long. So I applied some glue, I clamped it onto the bed, and then I secured it with some nails. And now it's time to make a stop blocker. This will help to guide the blade into the slot. So I copied the measurement and I made the cut on the miter saw. I applied some glue and then I secured it with nails. I wiped away the excess glue with a paper towel and this is what it looks like. Now it's time for me to create the mounting brackets. I ripped another piece of plywood on the table saw, the same width as the bed. And then I did a few trim cuts on the miter saw and this is what it looks like. So I applied some glue on the mounting brackets and then I secured them with some nails. I took the length and the width measurement for the back plate and this is what it looks like after I made the cuts. So this is the last piece to install. So I applied some glue and I made sure that the ugly part was facing towards the back. I used some clamps to help me to hold it into place and then I secured it using nails. So this is what it looks like before I mount it onto the wall. I'm going to install a hook on the back plate to hold the power cord from the saw. And this is what it looks like when it's in use. Alright, that's it for this one. If you like this video, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you in part 3.